Roland, welcome for coming. Thank you. Our speaker tonight is Eric over here. He's from Columbus, Ohio, by way of Lexington, Kentucky. Gee, I went to Ohio State up there for 2 years. Nice little town. Won't say that about Lexington, though. Frankfort's a much better town than that. Actually, he did live here in Frankfort for a while. He was over at Liberty Hall for 2 years?
4 years.
4 years, okay. Got a BA in, I'll call it history. I'll call the master's in history, although it's got a larger technical term that they use nowadays to make history sound highfalutin than that. So I'm sorry about that. He's now been over at Henry Clay for 10 years.
24 years.
Wow. I ran into him over there when I went over there and took one of their tours. Excellent tours over there that they give you. Haven't been to Henry Clay's estate over in Lexington. It's well worth visiting. And that out there on Richmond Road.
Correct.
Correct. Yes. Okay. It's hard to believe that where Henry Clay's estate was, you were out in the country 100 some years ago, and now you're 10th of a mile from downtown. How the world changes in that. But anyway, we're going to be talking about slavery at Henry Clay's estate. We are a slave state. We are a slave state up through 1866 when the 13th Amendment was passed. And when did we sign the 13th Amendment? 1976. We are a Union state fighting to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. So, Eric, come on up here and fill these people in about slavery over at Henry Clay's estate. And by the way, he's buried at the Lexington Cemetery. Well worth visiting his gravesite.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you very much for the invitation to come out tonight. I always appreciate getting out of the office to speak. That's always fun for me, and I always appreciate coming back to Frankfort. As Charlie said, I was the curator over at Liberty Hall for 4 years and lived here in town. In fact, for 3 of those 4 years, I lived right down the street on Wapping Street at the Orlando Brown House. That was a lot of fun most of the time. It had its hair-raising moments. The alarm went off one night at about, 1 in the morning or something. So I got up, went downstairs, silenced the alarm, went back up, started getting back in bed. Doorbell rang at the front door. I'm like, what is that? So I didn't even put a shirt on. I just went straight down to the front door and I opened it up. There was a Frankfort cop standing there looking very sheepish and somewhat scared. I said, may I help you? He said, well, I'm sorry, we didn't know anyone lived here. We were just fooling around. I said, well, someone does. Have a good night. So those things happen. But anyway, I very much enjoyed my time in Frankfort. Frankfort is a fun little town. It's a nice place to live. It's very comfortable. You can walk around downtown. It remains a small town in many ways. So it's always nice to come back and be back here to speak and to do things. The talk I'm going to present tonight, Reframing History, the Evolution of Interpretation at Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate, will look at where we've been, the journey we've taken to where we are, and where we are going to go, and mostly with respect to the issue of slavery. What we do now, we've done for a relatively short time, and it has certainly not been what we've done for most of our history. And that's true of most historic sites like Ashland. So this has been a tremendous evolution for us. I feel like we have done well in leading the state in what we've done. We've accomplished some remarkable things. We still have a lot of work to do. So we have a lot to be pleased about, but a lot we need to think about. If at some point you want to rehash this or read it in a little different form, I wrote an article in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society that is basically a written form of this that you can get in that publication. It came out, I don't know, a year and a half ago or so. So they probably have it here at the library somewhere. for most of Ashland's existence, and Ashland opened to the public in 1950. So we're at, Eric is doing math, be very afraid, 76 years. Is that right? Yeah. So we've been open a long time, and at Ashland, and at most sites like Ashland, history was whitewashed. Diverse perspective was not there. We weren't talking about enslaved people or indigenous history or even much about women's history for the most part. It was the interpretation of the great statesman Henry Clay, a great white man. That's what we were doing. And that actually had harmful impacts on diverse populations. I can tell you that in recent years, as we've really pushed forward with our interpretation of slavery, for example, when we have reached out to the African American community and said, why, if you haven't come to Ashland, haven't you? One of the things they've said is, we didn't come because there was nothing there we felt we needed to hear. You're not telling a story, or haven't been telling a story, that is relevant to us. You're not talking about the people who were enslaved. We can read a book about the enslaver. We don't need to go to a site for that. So that's the reality of it. By not telling these stories, we're denying the importance of them. We're denying the opportunity for people of color to hear things relevant to what they do. We're denying the opportunity for these people to perhaps connect with their own ancestry. And so that is an act of harm. Change has been slow. It's been incremental. There has been resistance to that change over the years. There have been actions that have set us back. But it has continued to happen, and it will continue to happen in the foreseeable future, thanks to things we've put in place that make that possible. In thinking about the evolution of our interpretation at Ashland, I frame a lot of it in information from this book called Representations of Slavery. This book is by Jennifer Eichstadt and Stephen Small. A pair of researchers who 20, 25 years ago undertook a research project to see what the state of interpretation of slavery was at historic sites in the South. Virginia, Louisiana, I think Georgia maybe, several sites in the Deep South. So they wanted to see what was going on. What they found at that time, 25 years ago, that there were 4 stages of evolution of this interpretation. Symbolic annihilation. It's not talked about, never mentioned, didn't happen here. We're not going into it, we're going to ignore it completely. Trivialization and deflection. Oh yeah, there were some people enslaved here, but they were happy and were treated very well. Minimizing it, not discussing it truthfully, not addressing the realities of it that existed. Minimizing it, making it seem like no big deal. Segregation. Sure, we'll talk about slavery, and we'll even talk about some of their lives and the things they did, but we're going to do it over here in the privy, and that's the only place we're going to do it. It's going to all be right there in that one little building, and that's it. Which means, if you go to the site and you miss that spot, you miss all that information. So you're not integrating it across the site so that it is mentioned every time that it should be and in every way that it relates. Which brings us to the final stage, relative incorporation. And what Eichstadt and Small found was that most sites, when they did their work, were in stages 1 and 2. Some had moved into 3, almost none had moved to 4. I would like to think that by now, if they did this again today, and I don't know whether they have any intention to or have even tried, that they would find a lot more sites that are at least in number 3 and many that are moving into number 4. That should have happened by now. We've done it, others should be doing it. So that's the framework that I use in thinking about what we've done and the way slavery and similar subjects have been interpreted at sites like Ashland. April 12th, 1950. This was a big day for us, an auspicious day. It was Henry Clay's birthday. and it was the day we opened to the public. That's the crowd that was assembled. That's on our back lawn. Back there are cars parked at the edge of the lawn. You can see a few of the houses that are back there. There are more back there now. Vice President Alban Barkley presided at this event. So it was quite the event. So with that, we began interpretation at the estate. And that was primarily the responsibility of this lady. Her name is Lorraine C. She was the first employee hired by the estate. She did the work of executive director, curator, interpreter, housekeeper, all sorts of things. But the title by which she was most frequently known is hostess, because the emphasis for her was on hospitality, making you welcome, giving good Southern hospitality to those who visited. She's the one that created the first interpretation. This is Lorraine in the drawing room conducting that interpretation. We have barricades today. Now today, you can't get close to that painting. It's completely barricaded off. That's a very, very important painting, and it scares me that these ladies' heads are that close to that particular painting, but that's her conducting a tour. This is the interpretation that she was using. That is the sum total notes that existed for the first tour at Ashland. So what she did was number artifacts, 1 through whatever, and she would go into a room and there'd be a little number on it, and she'd point at that number and say, that's number 3, it is thus and so. So just statements. There's no real theme here, there's no depth, no exploration of a variety of topics. It's just, here's a painting, it's of this person, yada, yada, yada. And the goal was to sort of show off things that belonged to Henry Clay and that sort of thing, and beautiful decorative stuff. In the first 41 years of our existence, this was how we interpreted slavery. The only mention found of enslaved people or servants is beneath the portraits is a silver call bell for the servants. That's it. No mention that they were enslaved, no mention of what that entailed, just here's a call bell. We figured you probably would see that and want to know why there's this little handle. That's it. So this is very much symbolic annihilation. They're not talking about it. When Ashland opened in 1950, a decision was made that a formal garden was needed, that it was something that should be at a place like Ashland. So the Garden Club of Lexington was brought in. They were told, we'd like you to do this. Go about getting it figured out. And so they started doing that, and discussion was had about where it should go. There were 2 camps. Camp 1 wanted to restore a family garden, which is between the mansion and the formal garden and the cottage today. That garden had fallen into great disrepair. There wasn't much left, but it was there enough, and they had plans and things, so they could have restored that. That was Group 1. Group 2 said, no, we don't want to restore that. That was created by Henry Clay's granddaughter, has nothing to do with Henry Clay. We want to do a new garden. We'll do it right beside the cottage. It'll be great. The old garden group, the first group, said, you can't put that garden there. That was where the enslaved people had their garden, because it was behind the slave quarters, which we now know is exactly true. That's where the slave quarters were. They might well have gardened behind it. So they're saying, you don't want to do that. Well, the new garden faction won, and that's where the garden was put. Now, the slave quarters were gone by this point. I haven't found an exact date of their removal. They're not mentioned very much in Henry Clay's family's papers, which I think is not terribly surprising. But there is evidence enough that suggests to me they were removed in the middle of the 1930s. So they were gone. But when they created the garden, they scraped that site flat so they could garden it and planted this garden, which helped to obfuscate the history of slavery at Ashland for a very long time. That's not to say that the Garden Club came in with that specific intention. They did not. But it was the effect of the act that they undertook, an act asked for by the foundation and approved by it. So that's what happened. That's the formal garden in its early years. This is 1956. Again, you can see the houses back on Woods Point and on Ashwood. This lady is in the garden. I am especially interested in the fact that she is basically gardening in a business suit. Today they wear sweats and gloves and all kinds of things. But anyway, she's one of the early garden club members in the formal garden. In 1983, after 33 years of service, Lorraine C. finally retired. And when she retired, a new director was needed. So they searched and eventually hired this lady. Her name is Betty Kerr. Betty Kerr came in with professional qualification. Lorraine C. did not have that. She was a classically trained opera singer. But she worked very, very hard. She did a lot of good things. She helped grow the collection a great deal, accepted a lot of artifacts as donations. She made every effort anytime she could to bring in important people to the estate to heighten awareness of it. So she did a lot, and that's really important. She did what was needed at the time. But Betty came in and took over and brought a whole new sense of historic import and of historic professionalism to the estate. She had written several books about Lexington and its history. She understood how a museum should be managed, at least to some degree. So we begin to see a change here when she comes along. Another thing that happens is shortly after, we have a renovation. She discovers the site is in very difficult condition, very poor condition. And if something isn't done, major damage will ensue. We will lose pieces of our fabric. So a contractor is hired, and they renovate the estate. This is the group that renovated it, Phase 4. They're still around. Phase 4 construction is in Lexington. They've done a number of projects on historic structures. They're gathered in front of Ashland as it is being renovated. This is a big step because it changes the way the site is interpreted by focusing the focus on the whole Clay family rather than just on Henry Clay, which changes the nature of the interpretation as it relates to enslaved people, etc. So after that, interpretation is done. Now we're getting some real information. When Henry Clay lived at Ashland, he had around 600 acres. We now have 20. At one time, he owned 60 slaves, but by the time of his death, that number had dwindled to 27. He believed in gradual emancipation and provided for the emancipation of all his slaves in his will. There was once a slave quarter, but they no longer exist. So we have some information. We know how big the farm is, and that's about right. We know that at one time he owned around 60 slaves. In point of fact, I'm not sure the number ever crested 50, but it was somewhere in that vicinity. And it says that by the time of his death, the number had dwindled to 27. That may be taken from a statement of his assets about a year before he died. That statement is over at Transylvania University. I can't remember what exactly it says, but the number had gone down some. He was getting old and not farming like he was. So that's true. But then it says he believed in gradual emancipation, provided for the emancipation of all his slaves in his will. That is not true. This makes it seem like he freed the people he enslaved. In point of fact, we have, in all of the records that we can find right now, there were 144 people enslaved at Ashland. That's, or 145. That number is constantly evolving, but about that. We have records of emancipation for exactly 6. 6 of 145. He emancipated almost nobody. There were terms in his will that would have emancipated people born in 1850 or later at the ages of either 25 or 28, 25 for men, 28 for women. So 1875 would be the first year of emancipation. That obviously didn't happen because, as Charles noted, the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865 and slavery ended. So he emancipated no one with his will at all. But again, if this is making a picture that sounds less, or sounds better than it really was, they're moderating it. They are diminishing the reality of things, if you will. But at least we're starting to get some perspective on the reality of the number of people enslaved, et cetera. So we're into segregation. We have some spaces that we used at Ashland for this. The black and white photo is what we called the butler's pantry, which was a space created by the McDowells for the preparation of food. The guy on the stool is my predecessor, Jeff Meyer. The lady standing behind him is Sue Andrew. Sue Andrew has been variously a board member, docent, and volunteer assistant curator to both Jeff and myself. She's been doing this at Ashland for, I think we're at 27 years now. She's still going strong. I couldn't do half of what I do without her, but they're in the butler's pantry. This space is a service staircase and hallway at the back of the estate. So we're talking about all of these things in only that space. We're not talking about it through the rest of the house. So again, we're in that segregation stage, but we've moved ahead. We're at least not denying it. So that's progress. The last tour script my predecessor wrote, he called Tour Script Ultra 2001. It contains a number of important facts. One incident involved Theodore, the eldest son, who in a rage threatened to stab on one of the slaves. During the McDowell's time, several servants helped maintain the house and property, but in Henry Clay's time, that work was performed by domestic and field slaves. The slaves that Henry Clay owned were crucial to the successful operation of Ashland. Clay owned slaves for most of his life and at one time owned nearly 50, but his views on slavery are not always easy to interpret. So we're getting some acknowledgement of the people who were enslaved. Here's a fact about something that happened. There's not a lot more said about it. There's a lot of context that goes with that. That's an interesting story that has more to do with Theodore than it does with the people enslaved. He had mental health issues, so that's a long story. But we're getting some acknowledgement of it. We're not getting a lot of information about them. We're certainly not getting anything from their perspective. So this is, again, growth, but it is far from where we needed to be. I came on board in 2002. I began working with the interpretation, learning it, doing research, thinking about where we should and could go. And in 2004, I attended a symposium at Belmead Plantation in Nashville, Tennessee. If you've never been there, it's a great place. Very important horse racing operation at one time. Very nice house, very beautiful site. That's where I got this book. This was used in that symposium as a source material. We talked a lot about it, and we talked about how we could improve interpretation of slavery at our sites. So things like terminology, using the term slave versus the term enslaved person, using the term enslaver or master enslaver rather than master or owner. These things are important. They make a big difference in how you think about and what you say about the people you're talking about. If you use the term slave, it connotes an inherent condition, like male or female, white or black. Slavery was not that. It was an action perpetuated on those people by someone else. Enslaved person tells you this person is being acted upon. They are being enslaved. The people who are doing that are enslavers. It puts the responsibility where it belongs and shows you, explains the action. That's important. Other things we talked about, identifying enslaved people by name. It's great to say the enslaved did this or this was done to the enslaved, but it's much, much more impactful to say Aaron Dupuy, this happened to Aaron Dupuy, or Aaron Dupuy did this, or Charles Dupuy did that or worked in this capacity. Now you're giving specific names. You're preserving and distributing specific stories. So we started doing that. We also started using imagery. We're fortunate to have 2 images. At the time, we were using reproductions. We at least had reproductions of images of 2 people enslaved at Ashland. That's really incredible. Very few sites have images of this sort. That makes it much different. Now you're not just talking about these people, now you're putting a face to them. Now you're putting something out there that people have to look at and think about and see them as real human beings. This was tremendously important, so that's what we did. We had also done a big exhibit at the International Museum of the Horse on Henry Clay as a horse racer and breeder and that of the legacy of his family. It generated many, many new artifacts that hadn't been in our collection that were out and about. A lot of those were lent or donated to Ashland. Many of them are in our collection now. Those artifacts have permitted us to vastly expand our interpretation and to cover slavery in a much different and much more substantial way. We also, around that same time, started doing archaeology in the slave quarters area. We've done archaeology at Ashland since about 1990 and continue to do so. This is an excavation in the slave quarters area. We knew from written sources that there were brick slave quarters. This confirmed it. We found remnants of brick. We found very little of these buildings left. They were obliterated and very thoroughly removed. One feature remains. You see the little pit next to that orange bucket? That is a pit dug into or under the floor of the slave quarters. In that pit, enslaved people stored food or perhaps personal belongings. So there are several of those. That's the one feature we have left of our slave quarters. We found a number of important artifacts that potentially illustrate the lives of people enslaved at Ashland, pieces of pottery that they would have used, nails. We found a marble that might have been used by an enslaved child. I don't know. Most interestingly, we found 2 graphite pencils. In general, enslaved people were not permitted to learn to read and write. Enslavers did not want the people they enslaved to become educated, to gain information about the world out there beyond the plantation, because that created the possibility of enslaved people gaining agency and potentially leaving or other things. So they didn't want that to happen. The fact that we have 2 pencils indicates that the enslaved community at Ashland may have actually been literate, or some members may have been. One thing that complicates this picture is that in 1865, the family sold this property to a man named John Bryan Bowman, who was assembling a new educational institution called the Kentucky University and Agricultural and Mechanical College. That institution used the Ashland campus for student housing and the mechanical campus, what would today be called engineering. I think some of those students might have lived in the slave quarters. They certainly lived in the keeper's cottage right next to it. So what we may be finding are pencils that belong to college students rather than enslaved people. It makes it complicated to interpret this picture because we're talking about events very close together in time. So there's not going to be a lot of difference in the archaeological level context for those artifacts. But anyway, this was very useful and important to expanding our picture of enslavement at Ashland. And it allowed us to bring interpretation onto the property in the form of signage. So for the first time, we have acknowledgement outside on the property where anyone can see it at any time of enslavement at Ashland. This is a huge step forward. That had never been there before at all. So that's great. We got a panel on the archaeology and what was found. We got a panel about slavery itself. Another project we undertook about 2009, 2010 was the reinterpretation of a room, this room, as the dressing room, a place for Henry Clay to dress, to bathe, etc. And almost all of the artifacts in this room are Henry Clay's, including the white vessel on the floor in the center of the room. That is Henry Clay's footbath. You don't ever have to wonder about how Henry Clay felt because he tells you explicitly in his letters. And often the answer was bad. And he apparently suffered from sore feet, which, given the nature of shoes in that period, no Air Jordans, there were all leather soles with very little padding. That's not all that surprising. So he soaked his feet often. When he did that, his valets, either Aaron Dupuy or Aaron's son Charles, would have filled that vessel, put in whatever salt or whatever he's using, and when Henry Clay was done, they'd have picked it up, take it out, emptied it, cleaned it, and put it away until it was ready for use again, needed for use again. So that's an important artifact. But we use this room to tell the story of the people enslaved at Ashland. We created a space within the larger house to tell this story in a room that was more comfortable, where we could tell it more completely. We added the images. We've got some documents, emancipation documents here. So we're telling much more complete stories. We tell the story of Aaron Dupuy's wife, Charlotte, who sued Henry Clay for her freedom in this room. We also interpret Henry Clay's plan for gradual emancipation of enslaved people and colonization of those people to Liberia on the west coast of Africa. A plan that did not work, but was his primary plan to deal with the issue of slavery. This document is one that belonged to Henry Clay, and it is a response he gave to a petition to emancipate the people he enslaved, a petition presented to him in Richmond, Indiana by a Quaker when Henry Clay went up for a dinner in his honor and a speech. So we have that out. So we've got a lot more artifacts out now. We've created a space. We're dedicating space and time to this in our tour. At this same time, I began work on another artifact in our collection that had been there and hadn't been dealt with until that time. This artifact was found in a brown paper bag up under the eaves. When Ashland was transferred from the family to the foundation that operates it today and has operated it its entire history, the Henry Clay Memorial Foundation, the centennial of which is this year, we're celebrating that this year, there were a lot of items put away by the family that the family hadn't ever sorted out. And so my predecessor made it his business to go up under the eaves and in the drawers and whatever and find all this stuff. This is what he found. It is nothing short of amazing. Native American beadwork. This, at the time that I encountered it, had not yet been researched. There's a little piece of paper there written by Henry Clay's great-granddaughter that says this beadwork given to Henry Clay by the Indians. Well, that doesn't narrow it down much. There's a whole lot of people who fit that category. So what is it? Where did it come from? Whose is it? Well, I can tell you, having consulted with many other museums and indigenous people, this shoulder strap, the thing with the three lobes at the bottom and the square thing at the top, are two parts of one bandolier bag, which was worn across the shoulder on the hip. In it, you carried ammo, flints, powder, other accessories for hunting, knife, things like that. That particular bag is very diagnostically Lenape or Delaware. I don't think there's much question of that. That's what it is. The other piece is more complicated. It is a sash or belt, and it has the name Henry Clay on it, H. Clay, and two eagles. There's nothing much indigenous about that. That was done for Henry Clay because he was a political figure, etc. So it's harder to establish what Native American group may have done that. I have seen imagery of Creeks wearing sashes that look very, very much like this. There were other Native American groups that wore sashes like this. The Cherokee, for example, Henry Clay spoke in defense of the Cherokee more than once. So I think that's possible. I'm not dead sure. I am now somewhat unsure whether this was one gift or two. But one thing I learned in this research, thanks to Google Books, which is a miraculous resource, there's a second one of those sashes or belts. It is in a museum called the Mercer Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. It was given by Henry Clay's son Thomas to a man who lived in Pennsylvania who named his son Henry Clay whatever. Lots of men did that in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. So he sends this belt and says, I think your son will really like it. My father received it from the chief of a northern tribe. So now we've narrowed it down to 50% of the Indians in North America. So that's progress. So I'm still working on it. But we're able to interpret this now and talk about Henry Clay and his involvement in Indian removal and extermination. I did a big exhibit with this at its center, and I've exhibited it several more times since then, and we've acquired even more artifacts to go with it. About 2017, something like that, 2016, we had a woman come to the estate in the wintertime. She was walking the property and she read this panel. When she left, she went back to her home. She was from Cincinnati and was apparently a graduate student, I think, there at UC or something. She sent us a very nice email complimenting us on having signage and acknowledging slavery, but she said, I'm concerned about this sign because in it you equivocate on the issue of Henry Clay as enslaver. You say sometimes he was a kind master and sometimes he wasn't, which equivocates on the reality. There is no kind way to enslave a person. You can't do that. When you are depriving a person of liberty, freedom, the right to choose their own life, etc., you can't do that kindly. She was right. My boss and I spent a lot of time thinking about this, contemplating what it should say, and eventually We completely revised it to tell a much more truthful accounting of the nature of slavery at Ashland that jibes with our main tour in the house and would jibe with the tour we would later do about slavery at Ashland. So it's a much more honest and accurate sign now. And it caused us to think that we needed to do more research, more information, and to create better interpretation. So I've been to a lot of repositories, UK, Transy, the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, the Library of Congress. I spent a week there a couple of years ago going through the Henry Clay family papers. That's about 18,000 items. I didn't get nearly through that. I went through about 500 or 600 items. But we have lots of documents. That's an emancipation document. That one's a really weird one. That's a case where a man wrote to Henry Clay and said, I think you enslaved my brother and I would really like him to be freed and would like you to consider that. In this case, the man who wrote the letter and the man that Clay ultimately emancipated were both enslaved by Henry Clay's parents. And Clay's brother had inherited the other man and sold him. So Clay bought him and then emancipated him because of the request from this man who had also been enslaved by his parents and whom Clay had known in childhood. And that's mentioned in the letter the man sends to Clay. So this is a really interesting and odd story, but that's the deed of emancipation. This is a ledger. This is from a ledger Clay kept in his home of expenses and income. And here he's hiring out two men, Sam and Aaron Dupuy, for $17.99. This is a practice that enslavers undertook when they had enslaved people for which they didn't have jobs. They would hire them to other individuals. This was negotiated in the middle of December. It became effective on January 1. So New Year's Day became a day greatly feared by enslaved people because they were often separated from friends and family, from places they knew, and sent off to other people they did not know, and that they could not be sure how they would be treated by. So it was a day they feared. In this case, Aaron, by the way, was 11 years old when he was hired out. This is a census record, which are very interesting. This is 1860. That's Henry Clay's son John and his wife Lucretia, and it lists the people they enslaved. Now there's no names, but it tells us their ages, it tells us their genders, and then the last column over there is a racial identification. There were three possible identifications in the census record: white, black, and the M is for a racist term, mulatto. Mulatto is not a word we use now. It comes from the Spanish for mule, and it refers to people of mixed race ancestry. So you can see that these are mostly black. There are at least two mulattoes in that list. They are of a range of ages, teenagers mainly, 20s. There are a few in their 40s. So that gives you a sense of the people they were enslaving at that time. So these are the kinds of records we're finding to build the stories we're telling from. And those became a tour called Traces, Slavery at Ashland. We worked on this tour for about 2 years, doing research, formulating stories, arranging them into a tour, writing it up, and then getting feedback from the community. We had a public listening day where we invited anyone who wanted to come listen to us, talk about what we were going to do, and provide feedback. This was a sample tour we did for a group of advisors that we put together. And once we had all that information, we finalized the tour and launched it beginning of March of 2020. And I think we all know what happened next. Here came COVID and shut us down. We did have at least one school tour. This is one of the first school tours we ever did. We do this for schools. We have modified it to deal with some of the information about sexual exploitation, some of the violent content. We don't want children traumatized by it, so we have worked to do that. The woman that you see holding the tablet is a former colleague. Her name is Cameron Walpole. She now lives in Washington, D.C. and works at Lincoln's Cottage. She and I worked to create this tour. She's holding that tablet. That tablet is really important. It's one of the most important parts of our tour. We use it to display documents and other artifacts that we don't necessarily have physically or that we want people to be able to see. It means that what we show gives source to the information that we're providing. Another thing that we do with this, which is probably the most powerful thing in the tour, is that we have a recording of a speech given by a man named Lewis Richardson, who self-emancipated from Ashland, used the Underground Railroad to flee to a town called Amherstburg, Canada, and speak about slavery at Ashland. So we have an account of it by someone who experienced it in this speech. So we have a modern actor deliver that speech, and it is immensely powerful. So that's been a great tool. We've also adapted our mission, our current mission statement you see here, to foster reflection, dialogue, and a deeper understanding of our shared history. The Henry Clay Memorial Foundation preserves Ashland and its grounds as a national historic landmark, interprets Henry Clay's legacy as a great statesman and scientific farmer, and commemorates the lives of the people enslaved at Ashland. Core values, preservation, we preserve Ashland's history, artifacts, and grounds, ensuring public access for reflection and quiet enjoyment while maintaining our commitment to historic and environmental conservation. Civic engagement and education. Ashland offers adoptable programs in civics, humanities, and sciences, promoting inquiry and critical thinking. Our diverse curricula, from exhibitions to environmental projects, support learning for all ages. Connectivity. Ashland serves as a hub for civic discourse, promoting connecting organizations and leaders through events and partnerships and fostering regional learning and progress. So you can see here a greater emphasis on diverse interpretation, on approaching this from differing perspectives. We have, through these efforts, been able to add to our collection. We acquired the drawing of Charles. This drawing was actually made inside the mansion at Ashland, not the current one, Henry Clay's mansion. That's a long story. That's a separate power line. But that was done right at Ashland. So I have provenance on that from the day it was made. That's just unheard of. I don't have a handful of things in the collection for that, which that's true. To have a drawing of an enslaved man, for which that is true, a drawing that presents him in an unvarnished, non-derogatory manner is just incredible. We have acquired that. This is a political cartoon. This was a product of our public listening session, the Traces Tour. We said in our materials that we released to the public, if you have artifacts that you think we should know about, bring them to us. We'd love to see them. Somebody brought this thing in. This is the only copy known to exist of this cartoon. And it shows Henry Clay and his enslaved man, Charles Dupuy, having a conversation. That's how famous Charles became. Henry Clay made him the face of slavery at Ashland, whether he wanted to be or not. That's a remarkable piece. That is incredible. It's incredibly racist. The caricature of Charles here is horrific, as is the Negro dialect in the bowl at his head. But it's a powerful piece to have. We acquired this political cartoon. This shows Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun standing on an enslaved man. Calhoun is thanking Clay for finally coming around to a position of acceptance of slavery. It criticizes Clay's speaking out of both sides of his mouth on the issue, equivocating on it, etc. So again, a very powerful image. I haven't seen another one. So these are remarkable pieces that we've been able to acquire. And then lastly, we acquired this image of Aaron Dupuy. This is one that we had sent to Ashland in 91, 92 as part of the Henry Clay Memorial Foundation papers. They graciously allowed, because there were two, for us to have that one back. We did a press event, and press from every media outlet in Central Kentucky showed up. It was amazing. You can't buy that kind of good press coverage. It was really, that's Deirdre Skaggs, the director of UK Special Collecting, so, and that's my boss, Jim Clark. But it was really a remarkable thing to be able to do. I think it was extremely beneficial in all kinds of ways. So where do we go from here? Well, we have assembled an African American Advisory Committee. They have helped us through all of this tour building and interpretation and collection building, and we continue to consult them. We also have an Indigenous Advisory Committee now, and we're working on that interpretation. I don't know that we will do a tour like Traces for Indigenous history, but we will work harder to integrate it into our other tours and to do more of it, to use the important artifacts we have in creative ways to tell these stories. So we're working on that. The most direct thing that's going to happen is going to happen probably late May, early June. We're installing that at Ashland, a memorial to the people enslaved at Ashland. It is a statue. It's, I don't know, 10 feet tall, I think. It's big, pretty good size. It will sit on a base, I believe stone, and around the edge or on it will be the names of people enslaved at Ashland out there for all to read. So it will be inescapable that slavery happened at Ashland, and we will commemorate it through this amazing artwork that will go in at the estate. So there's a lot going on. We continue to do this work. Even after that, there's more research to do, more questions to answer, and that will go into our interpretation. I'll be happy to take questions. If you would like, our website is henryclay.org. There's lots of information on that site about the enslaved, about Henry Clay, all kinds of things, including if you want to take a tour, you can go there, buy your tickets and all. We open tomorrow for our season, so we hope we'll see you out at Ashland. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
The name Ashland, where did that come from?
It came from the ash trees on the property. We have two currently. At the corner of Richmond Road and Woods Point, there are two giant blue ash trees that are ancient. Those things are 275 years old or something. That's where the name comes from.
Have you been able to do any research on the any relatives or ancestors of the enslaved as far as future generations that are still around?
Yes, we are working actively to locate descendants. We are working with a few people whose ancestry seems to go to Ashland. That's very difficult to do. There is a thing, genealogically speaking, called the 1870 period. That's when slavery had ended, and for the first time fully, African Americans are going into the census by name and settlement. Before that, it's a much more difficult proposition because you're dealing with records created by enslavers. They didn't say these as human beings. They saw them as property. So they're not worrying about last names. They're not necessarily keeping track of all the details that we want, birth dates or weddings or whatever. So it becomes very complicated. But yes, we are working at that. And I hope in the near future we'll have even more descendants. I know they're there somewhere. You can't have that many people enslaved at a site like Ashland and not have some. I think most of the people who are descended probably don't know it. They may not have felt they could ever figure it out. I hope they will come to us and seek assistance with that, and I hope we can provide it. Yes, sir.
Is there a cemetery, or did they put deceased slaves?
That's an interesting question. Yes, if there was an enslaved cemetery. Logically, yes, I think there probably was. Where was it? I do not know. We have never found it. I don't have any source that locates it that I can say is authoritative or accurate. So I don't know. We have recently completed, or are in the process of completing, some surveys of the entire current historic property, 16.7 acres. We have used techniques like ground penetrating radar, LIDAR. These are techniques that allow one to see what is in the ground archaeologically. Remnants of old buildings, features, artifacts, that kind of thing. What we were hoping was that it would find for us, if there was one somewhere, that slave cemetery. That hasn't happened. So I don't know where it was. We're working on that. I do hope we can find that out. There are a few things we know. I know that Aaron Dupuy and his wife Charlotte are most likely buried in a mass grave at African Cemetery No. 2 in downtown Lexington. They died long after slavery ended, or after slavery ended, so that's where they were buried. So I know those two. But as far as the ones that were buried at Ashland, and I think there must have been, we know from Clay's records that he's buying coffins for enslaved people. If he's buying coffins, he's got to put them someplace. I don't know where that was. I've not yet figured that out.
So if it was a 600-acre farm, it could be a lot of places, right?
It certainly could, yes.
Which way did the farm go? Like,
So the general boundaries of the farm, Hanover Road and Richmond Road, out to Hanover Road, to Richmond Road, and the edge of the Easter Seals property, what used to be Shriners Hospital. Back along that property, it kind of curves around over to Shinaway and maybe across Shinaway just slightly, and then down to Tate's Creek, and up Tate's Creek to Hanover Road. So that's the basic perimeters of the property. So it could be anywhere on there. Unfortunately, almost all of that has been developed into housing, retail, churches, schools. So I sincerely hope they aren't under any of that. No one has ever come to me and said, oh my goodness, I found this body in my backyard. But I don't know. There are some cemeteries, there's at least one cemetery I know of on the perimeter of the farm that is not an enslaved cemetery. A lot of people thought it was. It's not. It's a cemetery of other white people who lived on a farm adjoining Ashland. And it's in the yard of a house off Chinook. I forget the name of the road. It's like there's a little hedge between the two houses in the front of the house along the side of the driveway. There are 6 or 8 graves in there. I've often wondered how that goes when those houses come up for sale. Congratulations, you get your own dead people. My parents bought a farm in Gary County. They got their own dead people. They had a little cemetery back behind the house on the farm. But anyway, we have not found a slave cemetery yet.
So if he had 50 or 60 people there at a time, did they have several houses or?
Well, and he's got the house. So there are people enslaved to the domestic order. The house, the carriage house, the family garden, all that stuff. Then there are people who are enslaved to work in the fields. They lived in quarters that would have been somewhere near Christ the King. So they lived out on the farm. So they're working, the majority of those people are working in hemp. That was the primary reason Henry Clay enslaved him, to grow and process it. That was his cash crop. Ashland was a plantation. It fits that definition perfectly.
And you knew these. I knew they raised hemp. Did he break the hemp down and have his own twinery, or did he sell it just like over here at the one arm on the river?
So repeat that.
They raised hemp.
Right.
So did he make his own twine, or did he just sell the stuff to somebody else to make twine? And cable and rope?
Henry Clay did both. He owned rope walks in Lexington, so he had some of it made there. He had others he'll send to other people's rope walks and factories to be made a rope for and cotton and bagging for the cotton industry. So he did both things. He sold raw hemp and he had it manufactured into these bags and rope that he then transported to the plantations of the Deep South. Yes, sir.
At the beginning of your talk, you're kind of talking about the timeline of making progress of bringing all this to light. Kind of early on, I kind of felt like you insinuated that there was a lot of pushback of maybe not bringing this to public.
Well, I think for a lot of years there wasn't pushback because nobody ever thought about it. Nobody even approached the subject. It wasn't until the 90s, I would say, that we started doing things saying, maybe we need to talk about the number of people or this or that, and really started acknowledging that he was an enslaver, that he started getting some degree of pushback. And even when I came, there was some pushback. We had a core that was transitioning. We still had people interpreting Henry Clay the kind master. So we worked through that and eventually got through it just fine, and people understood what we were doing. And I worked very hard to make sure that I didn't just say you must do this. I explained why and what the effect of doing it the way we needed to do it was. So we got there, but yes, there was definitely some pushback, some resistance. There were some challenges.
Yeah, when I was dosed up at Fort Boone, up on Fort Hill, the Confederate attack, June 10th, 1864, the workers up there are all slaves that had been hired by state government to build the fort up there. So that's our connection to slavery.
That makes sense. I could definitely see that.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things is I was involved in research on a book on the Kentucky Central Railroad, Covington to Lexington, Nicholasville. And after the 1864 Morgan raid, they needed guys to repair the track. So what they did on Sunday, they went out and surrounded churches which colored people went to. and you were rounded up as the men came out and taken out to work to repair the railroad. If you were free, you got your meals. If you were a slave, your owner got paid for your service.
Huh. Again, I could see that. That makes sense.
Well, I thank you for all coming. I have not got a speaker yet for our next session, but in September, we will have here General Ulysses S. Grant, who will talk about the capture of Fort Donelson.
Return from the grave.
It's the third Sunday in September. It's going to be a little bit different, so I just thought I'd mention that. So look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for coming.